Hi everyone, welcome to The Enthusiastic Buddhist. In this episode I'm going to be looking at the topic of reincarnation, rebirth and past life evidence. Rebirth, multiple lives, life after death. Do you believe in it? Have you or anyone you know had a past life experience? Are you skeptical? Are you looking for more scientific proof before you consider it a possibility? Rebirth is an interesting topic and there are many people who believe in it. Before studying Buddhism, I was neither on the side of being a believer or a non-believer. I was looking for more proof that it was an actual possibility, and I happened to come across some things that opened my mind more to the idea of rebirth, which is what I want to share with you in this video. Rebirth is an important topic in Buddhism because the concept of rebirth underlies a lot of the Buddha's teachings, but I should stress that you don't need to believe in rebirth and multiple lives to study and practice the Buddha's teachings. It's not some kind of prerequisite. There are many aspects of the Buddha's teachings that people can benefit from without needing to have a belief in rebirth, such as practicing meditation, doing meditations on loving kindness and compassion, and studying Buddhism's rich philosophy. But getting back to whether rebirth exists or not, the most compelling evidence I feel that supports the idea of multiple lives is the research being done on past life recollection. I've always been interested in the possibility of recalling past life memories, but the closest I've come to having one is only knowing someone in my family who's had one. The interesting thing about past life recollection is that they can happen to us whether we're religious or not, and that can even happen when we're just going about our everyday lives. A family member of mine had a vivid past life recollection, though not being a believer in rebirth, he couldn't say whether it was a past life recollection or not, and he didn't want to be identified in this video, but he was happy for me to share his story, and this is what he told me. He was visiting the city of Sydney for a meeting, and he was staying in a motel that was a short ferry ride from where the meeting was being held. One afternoon, when he was returning back to his motel, he missed the ferry that he would normally have taken, so he decided to take another ferry from a different part of town. The ferry he then had to take was a small vintage ferry which only carried about 30 people or so. It wasn't one of the larger newer models. Now everything was completely normal until it was his turn to step onto the gangplank to board the ferry. The instant he stepped onto the gangplank, he was transported into the early to mid 1940s. He could see that he was wearing the blue uniform of the Royal Australian Air Force and that the people in front of him on the gangplank were dressed in 1940s clothing, including men in uniforms. Now the state only lasted for a few seconds, but it was crystal clear, and the memory has stayed with him for over 30 years. He told me that by far the strangest aspect was the feeling he experienced in that instant. Though he's absolutely certain he's never been on that wharf before, having never lived in Sydney before, the moment he stepped onto that gangplank, he had this overwhelming sensation that he was home, that he knew this place, just as he imagined an Air Force pilot would feel if he was returning home from overseas. He said of all the impressions he retained of the experience, it was this feeling that he knew this place, that he belonged there and that he was home, which has stayed with him for over 30 years, and yet home was an entirely different city in Australia altogether. These stories might sound interesting, right? But we want more proof before we start believing in past life recall and rebirth. Fortunately, there are some scientists who have dedicated their lives to studying past life recall and assessing the accuracy of the person's claims. There's one scientist named Dr. Jim Tucker, who's the author of the book Life Before Life. He conducted 40 years of scientific investigation into children of past life memories. In particular, he was interested in children who remembered precisely who they'd been, where they'd lived, and who had birthmarks on their bodies that matched the fatal wounds of the people they claimed to have been in their past life. For example, a child from Sri Lanka, almost 3 years old, began telling in detail about her previous life as a male incense seller. She remembered the village she'd lived in, which was 145 miles from where she was currently living, the brand of incense he'd sold, which wasn't a brand that was readily available in her town, the names of his wife, daughter and school, and she remembered he had died colliding with a large vehicle. When one of the girl's teachers went in search of such a person who had lived, they found someone who died 2 years before this girl was born who fit that very description. In fact, when the two families, that of the deceased man and the young girls met, they found that many of the statements were accurate and that the birthmarks on her chest and ribs matched the exact location of the fatal wounds that were shown on the man's autopsy when he'd been hit by a truck. And this wasn't an isolated case. After 40 years into this kind of research, Dr. Jim Tucker concluded that reincarnation or rebirth was the most plausible explanation for the thousands of cases he studied. Now you're probably wondering how something in our previous life could affect our body in this life, right? Well, I guess it really comes down to the important connection between our bodies and our minds. Studies have shown that the mere suggestion of trauma can create physical reactions in our bodies. For instance, when some people were asked to re-experience the trauma of being tied up, deep indentations resembling rope marks actually appeared on their arms. And again, in other studies, people produced boils just when the mere suggestion of being burnt was made. So these sort of studies suggest that the mind is powerful enough to produce actual physical changes in our body. So therefore, if rebirth does exist, then it's possible that traumatic fatal wounds could have such an impact on the mind that those imprints could produce changes in our future physical body, thus resulting in corresponding birthmarks on us. Now, the important thing about past life memories is that when people have them, it isn't like having some kind of vague memory as if they were daydreaming. These memories are said to be vivid and clear, as if we were re-experiencing the event again. People who have had past life memories, or even memories from when they were still in the womb or as a baby infant, also have this unshakable certainty that the event actually happened, and it wasn't just something that they created in their own minds. For instance, Ajahn Brahm, a monk and abbot of the monastery in Western Australia, wrote in his book Mindfulness, Bliss and Beyond about recollecting a childhood experience after one of his meditations. He was surprised to find himself remembering being in his pram as a baby, smelling the familiar smell of the pram, and even seeing the blue toy pig that he had had. He said of the experience that while he was sitting there as a 40-plus-year-old monk, he was remembering with extreme clarity the details of being a newly born infant, and there wasn't even the slightest bit of doubt that he was recalling an event from his early childhood. He said that the event was a complete surprise to him and it changed his view about memory. And this kind of certainty is emphasised again and again in the books written by Dr. Brian Weiss. He's a psychiatrist who was initially very sceptical about reincarnation or rebirth, but when one of his patients started experiencing past life memories in his office, and as a result not only did her present day problems begin to disappear, but she was able to disclose private details of Dr. Weiss's life, he became a believer in multiple lives. In his first book, Many Lives and Many Masters, tells the story of his first and profound encounter with this patient. One of his following books, Messages from the Masters, is full of many extraordinary cases of people recalling vivid past life memories, as well as the stage in between lives. I really highly recommend reading these books. Now, near-death experiences are also another topic that lends weight to the idea of multiple lives. Near-death experiences are still a mystery to science. A lot of near-death experiences that have been documented, people talk about a stage after death when they're surrounded by light, they feel love, and sometimes a wiser being meets with them to help determine what important lessons that they've learnt in their life. So these accounts suggest that our lives are here opportunities to grow and to learn to love. They also suggest that death is just a transition between lives and it's not something to be scared of. The concept of rebirth really broadens our perspective of life. It gives us a bigger picture. If we do have more than one life, what value are we placing on this one right now? What kind of journey are we on? Do we value material wealth more than spiritual gain or developing ourselves as an individual? I certainly don't remember ever reading about a higher being asking the person after death, so how much money did you make? And then saying, well, that's not enough, you're going to have to go back. Now, if we look at the Buddhist perspective on rebirth, the Buddha stated without hesitation that we have had multiple lives and that our rebirths aren't just random, that there is a reason for them. The Buddha gave the name samsara to this perpetual wandering of ours from life to life. Samsara can also be translated as cyclic existence, and the reason for our continual rebirths is because we haven't yet figured out a way how to free ourselves from it. When the Buddha became enlightened under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya in India, he saw that sentient beings have had countless lives. He also saw that the experiences we have during our lives are determined by the good and bad karma that we previously created. Now, out of compassion, the Buddha wanted to see all beings reach a state where they no longer had to experience birth and death and all the potential sufferings that could be experienced during our lives. There's a sutra, or also known as a discourse, where the Buddha points out to his disciples, who were mostly monks at that time, that rebirth happens and that after all the suffering we've experienced, aren't we ready to look for freedom and enlightenment? The Buddha said, "Long have you repeatedly experienced the death of a father, the death of a brother, the death of a sister, the death of a son, the death of a daughter, loss with regard to relatives, loss with regard to wealth, loss with regard to disease, The tears you have shed over loss with regard to disease, while transmigrating and wandering this long, long time, crying and weeping for being joined with what is displeasing, being separated from what is pleasing, are greater than the water in the four great oceans. And he continues, long have you thus experienced stress, experienced pain, experienced loss, swelling the cemeteries, enough to become disenchanted with all fabricated things, enough to become dispassionate, enough to be released. So in that last verse, the Buddha is really saying that after all these repeated rebirths and repeated suffering, shouldn't we now be tired and be looking for some release, which is to gain enlightenment and experience ultimate happiness and freedom? So it was this path to ultimate happiness that the Buddha spent his entire life teaching about. He pointed out that there were two paths. One is the path that leads to worldly gain, and the path that leads to deathlessness, eternal bliss, is the other. The Buddha never denied that there was happiness to be found in this world. He very much encouraged wholesome relationships, friendships, etc. But the problem he could see was that any worldly happiness or pleasure that we found is fleeting and impermanent and cannot bring the everlasting happiness that we're all desperately trying to seek. In fact, it was because of his own realization of the impermanent nature of worldly happiness which catapulted him into a life of deep meditation and contemplation in order to find a path to happiness which he discovered through his own enlightenment. So everything the Buddha taught was to ensure that we created causes for our own enlightenment, which means practicing meditation, practicing virtue, creating good karma, increasing our wisdom, and generating the pure feelings of love and compassion to all. Then by doing all this, we can effectively increase our spiritual level to a point where we can end the cycle of rebirths and even choose to be reborn or not, instead of being at the mercy of experiencing any rebirth and all the sufferings that could be part of it. So are we believers of rebirth? Well, I'll provide you with some links below to the books I mentioned in this video so you can check them out for yourselves. I know after reading these books I was much more open to the possibility of past lives or rebirth. And I think in some ways it's nice believing in past life or future lives because it means that we're never really parted from our loved ones for very long. It means that we'll meet them again in a future life. And I know I've met some people in this life who I felt that I've known before in previous lives, and perhaps some of you can relate to that. And I also put a link below to a short YouTube video, which is a short Fox 8 news story about an American boy who had vivid recollections of fighting with the Japanese in World War II. So let me know what you thought of this video. Please like the video if you found it interesting or informative. Give it a thumbs up either up here or down here, depending on where you're watching this from. And make sure you subscribe to my channel for future videos. And if you want to read more, check out my website, enthusiasticbuddhist.com. And let me know in the comments below what you think about the concept of rebirth. Do you believe in it? What sort of evidence would you consider convincing? And definitely let me know if you or anyone you know has had a past life experience. I would absolutely love to read about it. So that's all from me. Take care everyone, and I hope to see you in the next episode.